I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, Ukraine assassinates a Russian senior officer from the National Guard, and Moscow launches the biggest autumn conscription round since 2016. We also look at Russian influence on European politics from the UK to Hungary. And finally, we speak with Ukrainian-American poet Ilia Kaminsky, whose award-winning book, Deaf Republic, about a fictional village resisting occupation, has now been adapted to the stage.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 30th of September, 3 years and 220 days since the full-scale invasion began. I'm joined by Associate Editor for Defense, Dom Nicholls, and Ukrainian-American poet, Ilya Kaminsky. Let's go to Dom for the military updates.
Thanks, Adélie. Hello, everyone. Let's start inside Ukraine. The Donbass grind continues. You'll know what I mean by that. Very little movement, but there is some movement such that if I don't reference it, I get people saying, oh, typical Ukraine, blah, 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 fake news, all the rest of it. So very small movement west by Russia in a very small number of places in a small part of a very big country. Elsewhere across Ukraine, 65 drones were fired last night by Russia. 19 got through air defence, killed 9, injured many more across the country. In Sumy Oblast, a Russian attack there killed an entire family. A 35-year-old man, 26-year-old wife and their 2 children, aged 6 and 4. A drone hit a residential building in the village of Chernochichnya. That's about 50 km south of Sumy city itself. Now, also today, Ukraine's military intelligence department released a video which it says shows the assassination, well, they say the elimination of a Russian officer, his driver, and an assistant deep inside Russia. This is said to be a senior officer in the Russian National Guard. The operation is thought to have taken place in the North Caucasus region on Saturday. The individual was said to be a lieutenant colonel. He and his aide and driver were killed near the village of Tambukan in Russia's Stavropol Krai region whilst travelling to a training ground, the agency, HUR, said in a statement this morning. This is about 400 kilometres southeast of the Kerch Bridge, just north of Georgia. Now, the assassinated officer is thought to have been the commander of the avant-garde unit of Russia's National Guard. They're tasked with maintaining public order and combating terrorism and illegal armed groups, as Russia has it. This operation said to have been carried out with the support of a group called the Caucasus Liberation Movement, according to Ukraine's military intelligence. They released the footage this morning showing the party, the sort of vehicles, including the Russian officer, being watched from afar, and then a couple of explosions hitting the moving vehicle. Elsewhere, sticking in Russia, in the biggest autumn conscription round since 2016, Putin has called up 135,000 men aged 18 to 30 to join the Russian military between October and December this year for routine service, which typically involves a year at a military base inside Russia. Russia, you'll remember, has 2 conscription cycles each year in the spring and the autumn. Yesterday, Putin signed the decree authorising the autumn 2025 call-up. Now, although conscripted military service does not necessarily mean these men will end up fighting in Ukraine, there have been reports of conscripted men being sent to the front line, and other reports that conscripts who complete their military training are then pressured into signing contracts to join the regular army, which does then mean deployment is more likely. Since launching the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Putin has increased annual conscription by an average of 5% each year. From 2022 to this year, my rough maths said it had gone up by 16%. Now, this latest round is the biggest autumn conscription drive since 2016, as I said, and combined with the 160,000 called up in the spring, means that this year is going to be the largest total call-up since the full-scale invasion started. So it's going to be 295,000 this year. And for reference, in 2022, it was 254,000 across both the spring and the autumn call-ups. 2023, saw 277, and 2024, 283,000. So as I say, a 16% increase this year from 2022. Now, this year's longest business card winner, Vice Admiral Vladimir Tsimlansky, the Deputy Chief of the Main Organisational and Mobilisation Director of the Russian General Staff, said last week that this upcoming conscription cycle is not related to the war in Ukraine. He points out Russian law prohibits the deployment of conscripts to combat, and as we know, Russia is very much a stickler for the law. However, conscripts are more usually used for border security, including in areas like Bryansk, Belgorod and Kursk oblasts that all border Ukraine. You know what's coming next. The Institute for the Study of War, the US-based think tank, says conscripted border guards' participation in combat during Ukraine's invasion into Kursk last year caused particular discontent in Russian society. So even though these individuals may only be in Bryansk, Belgorod and Kursk, they have, of course, been engaged in fighting. A little bit wider now, NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte, he met President of the European Commission Ursula von der Leyen this morning. They issued a joint press statement, said a few bits and pieces, among which Mark Rutte said the Americans have opened again the floodgates through the Pearl Initiative. This is military equipment and munitions for Ukraine, sourced from the US, bought through NATO. It's the prioritised Ukraine requirements list. That's what the Pearl is. Anyway, he gave no more details on that, but he did talk a little bit about the drone wall initiative. He said NATO is strong at standard setting, at capability targets, and the EU has this enormous power of the internal market, making sure that the defence industrial base is developed, making sure that the money and the assets are there to support Ukraine. And when it comes to the drone wall initiative, I think that's an excellent idea. And there was a first meeting last Friday, which we reported on. It said NATO was participating, bringing together the eastern flank states in NATO, working on this big issue. Now, he said the drone wall initiative was timely and necessary because, he said, in the end, we cannot spend millions of euros or dollars on missiles to take out the drones, which are only costing a couple of $1,000s. So we need the drone wall. You'll remember this drone wall concept is said to involve stationing ground-launched drones on NATO's border with Russia to tackle any incoming Russian drones or missiles. It's the new big idea. However, as Politico reported yesterday, German Defence Minister Boris Pistorius has expressed scepticism about the concept. So he was speaking during a panel at the Warsaw Security Forum and said, I very much appreciate the idea of a drone wall, but we should pay attention to manage expectations. We are not talking about a concept that will be realised in the next 3 or 4 years. We have to think and act in priorities, and there are others, I think. We need more capabilities and more capacities. Drone defence, of course, but not by a drone wall. Now, I have no idea what Mr. Pistorius meant by that last comment. I don't think anyone's actually talking about building a wall out of drones, but he seems to be pouring cold water on the whole idea. Now, this comes as Ukrainian military specialists arrived yesterday in Denmark to take part in joint counter-drone exercises called the Wings of Defence training. Ukraine's General Staff said this morning such exercises are an important step in strengthening the interoperability of the armed forces of Ukraine and Denmark and make our states stronger in their common pursuit of peace and security in Europe. For her part, at the press conference this morning, Ursula von der Leyen said the European Union will allocate €2 billion, that's about $2.3 billion US dollars, to drones for Ukraine. She said, we have agreed with Ukraine that a total of €2 billion will be spent on drones now. I just said that. This allows Ukraine to scale up and to use its full capacity. And of course, it will also allow the EU to benefit from this technology. Replying to all of that, President Zelensky on Twitter said Ukraine's experience is the most relevant in Europe today, and it is precisely our expertise, our specialists and our technologies that can become a key element of future Europe's drone wall, a large-scale project that will guarantee security in the skies. Okay, from the skies, let's go underwater. Final one for me. Explosive underwater drones can help win the war for Ukraine and stop Putin in his tracks, one of America's most decorated generals has said. Speaking to colleagues of ours at the Telegraph colleagues exclusively in New York, retired 4-star General David Petraeus said robotic submarines and other drones were a vital component in Ukraine's war machine. He said, this is the moment where Ukraine can stop the Russians cold on the battlefields if they are able to make even more unmanned systems. So the former CIA director said the continued development of deadly sea drones and cruise missiles, such as the Flamingo, that can strike deep within Russia, was key to achieving a Ukrainian victory, but Kyiv needed continued military assistance from the West to do so. General Petraeus said, "I drove an unmanned maritime system the other day at an undisclosed location in Ukraine, and it hit 100 kilometers an hour. It's amazing. Alongside aerial drones, Ukraine now has the Flamingo ground-launched cruise missile that travels 3,000 kilometers." He said it was vital that this £200 billion frozen assets held in the European Union was invested in Ukraine. And he said these kind of long-range drones, along with security guarantees and a tightening of sanctions on Russia by the EU and the US, are the three ways for Ukraine to win the war. He insisted all three of those points must be implemented together to force Putin's hands. And he said if those three sets of actions are taken simultaneously, I think you could finally get a situation where Russia would just be forced to halt the fighting because they can't achieve additional gains on the battlefield. As it is, he says Putin is not serious about discussing a ceasefire and cannot be trusted. He said the West has a lot to learn from Ukraine and should take the lessons to transform its own militaries into a series of unmanned systems in every domain of warfare, whether that be underwater killer submarines, his words, not mine, drones and cruise missiles. He said the Ukrainians have done this spectacularly well. The future of war is in Ukraine. Interesting comments. We put the link in the episode notes. That's us up to date, Adélie.
Thanks, Dom. And now for the diplomatic updates. Well, the Moldovan elections yesterday may have come as a breath of fresh air, a small but crucial wave pushing back on the Russia-friendly parties gaining ground throughout Europe. But elsewhere, Russia's influence continues, or at least continues to be uncovered. The latest case of which is in the UK. The European MP Nathan Gill admitted to accepting bribes and peddling narratives beneficial to Russia. Nathan Gill represented Wales in the European Parliament from 2014 to 2020 as a member of Nigel Farage's various political endeavours of the last 10 years, from the right-wing UK Independence Party, which promoted Brexit, to what is now Reform UK, the insurgent party currently leading British opinion polls and predicted to be the UK's next government. So what did Nathan Gill confess to? Well, he delivered pro-Russia statements in the European Parliament in 2018 and 2019 in support of Viktor Medvedchuk. Medvedchuk is a former Ukrainian politician who is close to Vladimir Putin and now lives in Russia after having been exchanged in a prisoner swap between the two countries. After Ukraine opened criminal proceedings against Mr. Medvedchuk for high treason, Mr. Gill appeared on a pro-Russian television channel, 112 Ukraine, in February 2019. And according to the prosecutors, he closely followed the line given to him, claiming that Viktor Medvedchuk had been persecuted. Mr. Gill also lobbied for Medvedchuk to be included in Ukraine-Russia talks over the war in Donbass and accepted payment to host Medvedchuk in the European Parliament at an event where he presented his peace plan for Donbass. The following day, Mr. Medvedchuk met with Mr. Putin in Russia and hailed the European Parliament meeting a success. This is yet another example of how Moscow is interfering with domestic politics in the hopes to prop up politicians and parties in their favour. Hopping just across the channel in both France and Germany, the links between Marine Le Pen's National Rally as well as those of Germany's AfD, to talk only of these two countries, have been exposed time and time again. And you will trust me that I will do a deep dive on Marine Le Pen's National Rally Russian ties when we get closer to the French presidential election. AfD politicians, for example, have appeared repeatedly on the news platform Voice of Europe, which is Russia's largest known influence operation on European politics, which was uncovered by the Czech services. That platform, Voice of Europe, was covertly financed by the same Viktor Medvedchuk that Nathan Gill was defending in 2018 and 2019. Meanwhile, there are continued tensions between Hungary and Ukraine, which continue to shapeshift. Remember, a few weeks ago, we talked about their tit-for-tat retaliation on gas and oil prices, about hitting a pipeline. This time, the tit-for-tat is happening in the information realm. It keeps on shapeshifting like that. Hungary announced last night that it would block 12 Ukrainian news sites after Ukraine blocked various websites deemed to contain pro-Russian views at the request of the security services of Ukraine earlier this month. They included 8 Hungarian-language portals, among them a popular pro-government news website, origo.hu. Viktor Orban's chief of staff, Gergely Gulyas, called Ukraine's move an entirely unjustified attack. Gulyas said that Ukraine banned the Hungarian portals because they wrote critically about sanctions against Russia and about military support for Ukraine, and that they also criticized the European Union and the NATO alliance as being fragmented and ineffective. A spokesperson from Ukraine's foreign ministry, Georgy Tichy, responded on X. The difference is that Ukraine blocks Russian propaganda, whereas Orban's government blocks Hungarians' access to fact-based journalism. But for them, the farther from the truth, the better. And to stay on the topic of Russian propaganda, the Kyiv Independent reports that Russian propagandists themselves have started to acknowledge that Russia's military campaign is faltering. Dmitry Rogozin, a Russian senator representing the occupied Zaporizhia region, went as far as saying that the front line had reached a deadlock and that Moscow was incapable of achieving significant advances. And finally, it's Pavel Gubarev, a former Russian proxy in Ukraine's Donetsk Oblast and veteran of the war, who pointed out that the destruction of Russian oil refining capacity by Ukrainian strikes had created a strategically advantageous situation for Kyiv. He continued, "In reality, the current situation is already tantamount to defeat for us. Russia does not have the capability to complete the special military operation with the achievement of said goals and victory under the colonial system of the current government." A harsher tone indeed. Ilia Kaminsky is a Ukrainian-American poet. He's the author of 2 award-winning volumes of poetry, Dancing in Odessa and Deaf Republic. The latter is about the fictional village of Vesenka, where occupying forces murder a deaf boy at a puppet show in the village square. In protest, the whole village decides to become deaf and to communicate only in sign language. Far from a disability, deafness then becomes a weapon of resistance against occupation and injustice. Published in 2019, this prescient tale has now been adapted to the stage. It was playing in London a couple of weeks ago and will be playing at the Dublin Theatre Festival from October 2nd to October 5th. I'll put the link in the show notes. Ilya Kaminsky is also hard of hearing himself. He uses a cochlear implant. So please bear this in mind when listening to our interview. I suppose I want to start with the origins of Deaf Republic. If you could give us your account of what the story of Deaf Republic is about and how you came to write it.
Well, the story begins with a pregnant woman and her husband at a public gathering when they see a soldier shoot and kill a young deaf boy, and the entire community decide to stand up and protest the authorities by refusing to hear them. That's the basic beginning of the book. How did it start? It's a little bit further away, I guess, simply because there's more than one origin story. There is me, I'm the author, who is 16 years old. At the time my family came to America. My father dies soon after. I write my first book, Dancing in Odessa, which is very much about Eastern European culture and trying to speak back to my father about the culture that he taught me. That book is published in 2004, and we having to ask myself, what is going to be my next book? Who am I? At that time, my wife and I, we moved around 2006 to San Diego, California, which is 9 miles from the border of United States and Mexico. Now, the border between these two countries today is very much in the news. At that time, in early 2000s, it's not necessarily at all a part of national discourse. But what do you do if you're a writer? You need a bookshelf. So you go to Home Depot, and outside usually there is a person or two who is trying to make $1 by helping you to load that bookshelf into the car. And at that time, suddenly ice car stops. And giant dudes got out and dragged the person into the car without any questions. And that is your first introduction to the border between the United States and Mexico. At the same time, you, meaning me, being from Ukraine, where I was born, similar kind of violence happens. And so you try to ask yourself, how is it possible that in the richest country in the world and in the poorest country in the European continent, you get to see similar images of violence? And you ask yourself, well, like any immigrant or refugee, how can you write any literary text that can speak to more than one audience? And that's how I began to think, I need to tell a kind of a dream story, a kind of a fairy tale, a fable. At the same time, of course, even though I live in America now, I was born in Eastern Europe and Soviet Union, heard many stories. My grandfather was, quote unquote, an enemy of the people. During Stalin's times, he was shot. My grandmother was sent to Siberia. In Siberia, in a camp, she spent over a decade. She came back full of stories. During the time that she spent in the camps, people tried to survive. So to celebrate certain holidays, they would make little puppets and do puppet shows in the barracks. When somebody was taken away or died, they put that little puppet on the bed of the person. So this kind of stories made it as a book, but they weren't necessarily the origin story. Then, of course, when I finished my book, I had to ask, what language even am I writing in?
How did you decide what language to write in?
Well, I live here in the United States, so it would make sense to write in English because that's a language that's all around me. But if I ask who I am, my native language is not really Russian or Ukrainian of Soviet Union or English. It's the language of lip reading. That means you and I are having a conversation. I'm looking at your lips, but I'm also looking at what's around you. And that's the language of lip reading.
Deaf Republic is also about choosing deafness as a response and as resistance against oppression. That rings very true for Ukraine now, especially since the beginning of the invasion in 2022. Now in Ukraine, I think this idea of resisting through language and resisting happens on different levels, with people choosing Ukrainian over Russian, but also in the occupied territories about actively resisting the occupation, which is what we see in the poem. That feels very prescient for you to have written such a story. How much do you see your work finding unexpected echoes in what is going on in Ukraine now?
I wish there was a very clear answer saying, yes, the book is exactly what is happening. But that is not true at all. Most people would say that what they call full-scale invasion began in 2022. The actual war began with the theft of Crimea. But of course, if one digs deeper, one can also talk about colonial history. And how did that happen? One can also talk about just the plain idea of borderlands. Let me give you an example. So My grandmother was born in the city of Odessa in 1918. The population was over 50% Jewish. My mother was born in 1939. The population was about quarter Jewish. By the time I was born in 1977, it was significantly less than that. Now it's 1 or 2%. So that is one family story. I'm the first person in my family not to speak Yiddish. Why did my mom refuse to teach me Yiddish? Because a relative of mine in our family in the city of Unmanned was beaten to death in the street for speaking Yiddish out loud. That's just one language. Obviously, similar thing is happening with Russian and Ukrainian right now, the tension around language. I don't necessarily think people do violence because of language. They make language into a weapon because of violence, not the other way around, to my mind. And that is just one way of looking at it. There's so many ways of talking about violence in the borderlands. Now, we again have a kind of tension between empires. Russia wants to be empire again. European Union and America, of course, have other ideas. And language becomes a symbol of survival. I go to Ukraine about twice a year. Not often, but sometimes one does have to go to a bomb shelter. I have never seen anybody read a newspaper in a bomb shelter, but I have seen people recite songs and poems to each other by heart. And that's what I mean by carrying language inside you and using it as a last survival tool. When you're running because of danger, you're probably not going to run while reading the newspaper, or reading a 1,000-page novel. But you might still hold a few lines of a poem, a few scraps of a song, trying to make sense of what is happening. So in that way, language is, use it like medicine, I would say. We still have this need to hold the language as something that's dear and near to us when everything else falls away. And that is difficult to talk about and yet essential to talk about, because it comes back to who we are as humans and why we do what we do.
Do you think Ukraine is, by choosing Ukrainian, by choosing to resist, by choosing another way of communicating amongst themselves, like the people of Vasenka do by choosing sign language, do you think Ukraine is becoming the Death Republic of your book?
I couldn't possibly claim anything like that. And I couldn't even say that Ukraine is chosen. It's a very huge country with many different people living in it. And it's not just Russians and Ukrainians. There is Tatar people from Crimea, for example. So it's a multinational country with people speaking many different languages. I have seen people who chose to speak Ukrainian after the war started, and then come back to speaking Russian, because it's one thing to make a proclamation and it's another thing to survive the 3 years of war. So I don't want to be this kind of a writer trying to sell a book and saying everything in the world is like in my book. The reality is very, very difficult. And let's remember that majority of area of the country that has been bombed is Russian-speaking. So Putin claiming that he's coming to protect Russian language is actually bombing Russian-speaking population. Of course, people stand up and protest, but it is not as simple as that. It's incredible trauma to have to change the language of one's parents. Even in Baltic countries, in Estonia, there is a large Russian minority that want to keep speaking the language of their parents, and it has nothing to do with Putin. It just has to do with how human beings survive as families. But to go into more inspiring territory, a friend of mine, the poet Boris Khersonsky, who was a dissident during Soviet times, known as one of the most beloved Russian language poets, living in Ukraine. When Russia began the invasion of Crimea, he was teaching in the university. He comes into the classroom and says, "Today I'm going to lecture in Ukrainian because we are defending ourselves against what is happening to us." So here you have an image of one of the most beloved Russian language poets deciding to speak in Ukrainian. So in that regard, yes, absolutely. It's very much using the language as defense in the book.
Another thing that is very striking is the opening poem of the book, which is "We lived happily during the war." And it is very much also about situating yourself in the United States while there is a war raging far away, and how we decide to care and to consider how big our community and our village is. What has been your experience of being Ukrainian and seeing this war unfold from America and seeing the response from the rest of the world?
When the war began, it wasn't unusual for me to hear from people in UK, from friends, from relatives, a statement such as following, quote unquote, "We are like reality TV for the West." And it wasn't at all unusual to literally be in Ukraine, in a bomb shelter while the bombs are falling, and watch people reading on Facebook the comments in the West about that particular bombardment while the bombs are falling. So it was perhaps the first war in which social media took incredible presence, because most bomb shelters have internet access. And people really could see the reactions in Ukraine, in Russia, on the West. And that was an incredible thing to realize in one's own body, that we here in the West live like the gods live in a Mount Olympus. And we imagine that violence happens somewhere else. That, of course, is not true. At that very time when the book came out, yeah, the big war broke out, yes, but also Black Lives Matter happened in the United States. There's a huge movement saying, no, the violence doesn't just happen somewhere else. The violence happens right here in our streets. And of course, that is going back to the question, for me anyway, the one I had to ask myself, who am I if I'm an immigrant or a refugee, living one foot in one world and one foot in another, seeing similar images? How do I put it into a book in a way to make sense? So that, in a way, is an attempt to make sense of it.
Your book is a book of poetry, but it is almost written as a play with a dramatis personae at the beginning. What was the process like for you as the writer to see it adapted on stage like it was in London?
Oh, it was beautiful. It was educational, I would say. They did a beautiful job. It led me to many questions about craft. For example, it was amazing how they used technology, film, to show time. So they have multiple layers of action happening at the same time. It was also fascinating to me how they use it. They use the same actor to play the soldier. And every time he's killed, he comes back and says, "You think you can kill me, but you can't." And that was striking and very effective, I think. The way they used the drone made it very real for the audience, because 21st century, right now, we realize it is a war of drones. So they used a lot of tools, which led me to ask, well, how would I do it if I was trying to do it in a book? What kind of tools would I use? In addition to being a poet, I'm a translator. I translate from Russian, Ukrainian languages. And this is the question of translations that I find fascinating. And also educational, I say, because at this point in time, translation as such is probably the most important art form we have, because we live in societies that become so closed. so authoritarian. And the idea of authoritarianism changes so much. You still imagine that a dictator is somebody like Hitler or Stalin, and the soldiers are marching. But that's 100 years ago. Today, the soldiers don't need to march like that on the street. Somebody just need to buy Twitter. And suddenly you close a lot of public discourse. So what is the way of keeping one's mind open in 21st century? It seems like what authoritarianism always wants to do is to close the doors. And what a translation does, any art of it can be translated into the other forms or just plain old translation of books, is to open the windows. The job of a translator is to open the windows. The job of any art is to open the window. And that for me personally goes back to a wonderful quote from a Spanish language poet, Garcia Lorca, who said, "Poet is a professor of 5 senses." What does that mean? Right now in the United States, I can go to a grocery store and buy a tomato any time of the year, any time of the day. It's going to look like tomato. It's not going to taste like one. It's not going to smell like one. We are given a product, but it doesn't speak to our senses at all. And we are taught not to use our senses because we're supposed to buy. And that's just one example of how art tries to wake up the senses in us. And one thing one feels, I felt anyway, I can again only speak for myself after leaving the show, is how they consistently, almost aggressively, try to wake up the senses of the audience. And of course, it's partly because the story itself is a story about using or choosing not to use the senses, in this case hearing. So it was very educational for me to watch how the story is told by using different means and how means change the story.
And as you say, translation is about opening window, and one of the translation issues of putting Deaf Republic on stage is integrating sign language, just the question of accessibility for people with hearing disabilities, but also with people who can hear, because a lot of the action happen with sign language on stage, which is not a position as someone who is hearing, like me, is often being put in. Just to explain to the listeners, it's done with surtitles where you can see what they sign, and they explain also the beauty of sign language, British Sign Language in this case, and how it conveys other senses and other representations of the words that we don't necessarily have with language. I remember very well at the beginning of the play when they explained the word for London. The sounds of it don't mean anything, but the sign of it in British Sign Language is something that goes like turning your hand next to your head as something that is spinning really fast, but also very overwhelming and also slightly crazy. And that gives a very multi-layered and very sensory image of what London feels like. As someone with hearing loss, it must have been quite playful and quite cheeky, I imagine, to see these boundaries being put on stage and people who can hear having to adapt to what's going on the stage.
There are many kinds of deaf communities. There is a deaf with a capital D, which is what we call deaf culture. And there is no universal deaf culture. The English one, which is very different from American one, which is very different from Ukrainian one, from French one, and so forth. It's centuries old, but it is also very new in some ways. It is also very much the story of Deaf Republic, the deaf protest, is very real. There was a movement, quote unquote, at least in the United States, oralist movement. But really all over, I remember it being in Soviet Union as well, where people were not allowed to speak sign language in schools, and where the oralism, meaning lip reading, was forced on them. Now, I grew up with lip reading, but imagine if you grow up in a deaf family and in school somebody forces you to read. Around the time when I came to America, a little bit before, Disabilities Act was signed. And big catalyst for Americans with Disabilities Act was the revolt at the Gallaudet University. Gallaudet University is a university of the deaf people, where the president was always a hidden person. And so at that time, the students revolted and they demanded the deaf president. And that was a big and inspiring thing. When my family first came here, when I was 16, we lived in Rochester, New York, which has a very large community of deaf people. The second large educational institution for deaf people is located in Rochester. It is called Rochester National Technical Institute for the Deaf. And deaf cultures usually blossom around universities. And of course, it led me to ask questions. For example, between 8 and 14% of people in the world are deaf or hard of hearing. Let's keep that number in mind. Now, let's talk about silence as a metaphor. The book mentions the word silence quite a bit. We can have silence between two lovers, or you can have silence of refusal, like in the book, A Protest of Silence. Or you can have a very different kind of silence, magnetic silence of metaphysics, when in religion and philosophy they tell you the silence of God is God. It's an incredible statement to make. But what happens to our theology, to our religion, to our philosophy, when we realize that it doesn't apply to between 8 and 14% of people in the world? Literally, many deaf people say, I don't have a word for silence. What is silence? It's not a part of my daily existence. So the book kind of tries to show the reader the deafness, the way our larger culture is creation of the hearing people. But then any rules are only creation of some part of society, right?
The play was just in London. It's going to go to Dublin very soon. Do you hope is going to be able to travel to Ukraine? And what sort of reception has your book had in Ukraine?
It had been translated in the Ukrainian, and there were wonderful reviews. The translator is a good friend of mine. She is from Bucha, which is unfortunately a very well-known city right now because of atrocities that happened there. He had to run under bombardment to escape. And later, when Ukraine recaptured the city, he came back to Bucha. And he had some very heartbreaking stories to share. Like people would find little bombs in their laundry machines. People would find little bombs left literally in children's slippers. And that is non-graphic imagery. There is also a lot of other imagery that might not be suitable for the program. So it was very moving to have him translate the book. But mostly I go for personal reasons. And of course, they end up being part of my writing. I interview people, I write about them. But this is just so real right now, is what is happening. You and I can have this conversation eating ice cream, and there will be people dancing in the street, and at night there will be bombardments. So those kind of contrasts. And yet poems are very much part of daily life. For example, when the full-scale war started 3 years ago, Odessa was full of refugees. And what happens when you're a war refugee or a displaced person? You arrive in a new town, you file papers, you try to find an apartment, try to find food, try to find a job. And while parents were looking for it, the children were just lost, they were just sitting in a bomb shelter. So with a bunch of friends, we decided to start community for kids, a poetry studio where the kids could have safe space, they can write poems, they can talk about, they can have a little bit of childhood despite what is happening around them. And the kids are of all ages. Some are 5 years old, some are 15 years old. And they have their poetry tourneurs, competitions, they write poems. we had 20 people signed up to come, but there were pretty bad bombardments at night. So about 10 people came. But they came despite those bombardments, 10 kids. And the idea is to help kids, yes, but also to help local writers who can teach them. Because what's not talked about at all is that people who are in business were able to live. They had money to live. People who are in technology, IT, physics, chemistry, engineering, were able to live. They have skills that are needed in Germany, in the Netherlands, and so forth. So who stayed? High school teachers, college teachers, museum workers, bookstore owners, booksellers, the language people who stayed, senior citizens, who stayed, little children. This is a war, a bombardment on people who cannot afford to leave the country. And we don't necessarily talk about it as much.
Thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
My only thing, what I have learned from that and my own experience, is that when I say something like European values or liberal values or freedom, what I have learned in Ukraine that it is not just lip service. People are willing to die for that stuff. And it's incredible to see a whole nation of millions of people stand up for those values, to say, yes, freedom matters, yes, freedom exists, yes, I'm willing to put my life on the line, yes, I'm willing not to have a job in order to support those who fight. Yes, I'm willing to put my daily hours in. And that's an incredible thing. So for me as a writer, that's an incredibly inspiring thing. And of course, it is very painful to see that crushed for 4 years in a row. And yet at the same time, Ukraine is still fighting right now as we speak. This war is not over. It is still ongoing. So still this fire, the human impulse to stand up. And that's an amazing thing. And the war in Ukraine is not a war somewhere far in Ukraine. It's in my living room. It's in your living room. It is right here, right now.
We'll go to final thoughts. Last Friday, as you know, we published the last of the short documentaries that David and I had been working on when he passed. That documentary looked at the politics of memorialization of the Holocaust massacre at Babi Yar near Kyiv on the occasion of the 83rd anniversary of the massacre, which is today. Well, I thought I would mention an example of thriving Jewish life in Ukraine for a change and to counterbalance. Last week, on the occasion of Rosh Hashanah, around 30,000 Orthodox Jews traveled to Uman in Ukraine. It's a city that is about 2.5 hours south of Kyiv and not far from Vinnytsia, where I was over the summer. Now, why did they go? Well, to visit the tomb of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who is the founder of a Hasidic sect. It's obviously a difficult time to go into Ukraine, but the war hasn't discouraged the pilgrimage. It's so massive that it's been coined the Jewish Burning Man in the past. And it's so much so that Ukraine is now considering introducing a pilgrimage visa. This pilgrimage also taps into the conflict in Gaza because this year, ultra-Orthodox men in Israel are newly eligible for the draft. This has been a topic of contention in the country for years. And so the scale of the pilgrimage begged the question, much like in Ukraine, should men eligible for the draft be allowed to leave the country? Well, for the first time, the Israeli military arrested dozens of pilgrims at the airport in Tel Aviv, and an opinion piece in Israeli newspaper Haaretz even called the pilgrimage a disgrace. Dom, what are your final thoughts?
Well, thank you, Adélie. So, today's the day. Now's the moment, actually. Pete Hegseth is on his feet. This is me listening to him now.
Are restoring both. As President Trump has said, and he's right, we have the strongest, most powerful, most lethal, and most prepared military.
Okay, so that's Pete Hegseth, US Secretary of State for Defense /War. He's in Quantico today, summoned hundreds of generals and admirals from around the world to attend this gathering in Virginia at the Marine Corps University in Quantico. It's been live streamed now on war.gov. He got to his feet about 2 minutes ago. He was saying pacifism is naive. The purpose of the newly retitled Department for War is war fighting, preparing for war and preparing to win. There's a huge audience, a very diverse audience. There's every possible shade of balding, late middle-aged white man you could imagine sitting in the audience listening to Pete Hegseth. Anyway, we're expecting this speech. He's pacing up and down. He's like a caged tiger. Anyway, we're expecting this speech to go on about the warrior ethos. Natasha Bertrand, who's CNN's Pentagon correspondent, said a number of officials have questioned why they all needed to attend this meeting in person when it's being live streamed. One defence official told her it's because Hegseth and Trump like the optics of having all the generals and admirals together as a captive audience for their remarks. You'll remember Donald Trump told NBC News on Sunday that he planned to attend the meeting. No sign of him yet, but he's supposed to be there, and that the purpose was primarily to talk about how well we're doing militarily. I'm sure people who've cancelled their holidays to come back and hear that are delighted. A senior Trump administration official also told the New York Times that the gathering is designed to, quote, get our fighters excited. Anyway, if you're there, this he's still yapping on. Here he is.
That'll showcase the speed, innovation, and generational acquisition reforms we are undertaking.
Get your buzzword bingo cards ready. He said innovation at least 5 times and acquisition reform twice since I've been watching. If you're there, please give me a ring afterwards. Let me know what you think. I'm all ears. It is, like I say, live stream now on war.gov. So I'm going to get back to that, Adélie. Thank you. Oh, hang on. He's having a sip of his coffee. Oh, no. Oh, he's literally having a sip of his coffee. I thought that was a metaphor, but no, he's literally sipping coffee.
I just love how the high level of technical prowess that you just displayed, putting my phone next to your phone on loudspeaker to try and hear him. That was very impressive.
This is the technical innovation that he's talking about, literally happening here in the studio. No one's done anything. No one's applauded or anything. No one's.
Of the department.
Hang on, he's still going.
Not perfect leaders.
Not perfect
Good leaders. Competent, qualified, professional, agile, aggressive, innovative, risk-taking, apolitical, faithful to their oath and to the Constitution.
Thanks, folks. We'll be there tomorrow with maybe a bit more of analysis on this very speech. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll be back tomorrow, same place, same time.
He's just said innovation again.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and Francis Dearnley answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights. Plus, maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each day on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.